There is a thing called an authoritarian personality, and in a sense, authoritarianism begins at home. And if we can switch to the slides, guys, this is, you actually can be brought up in an authoritarian family structure and actually sort of get, by just being raised in this family structure, a kind of a bootstrapping into this sort of authoritarian personality. And in this authoritarian personality structure, you can see it's hierarchical. The father is above the mother, who's above the child, right? The father makes decisions, the mother is subservient. Now you can contrast that with an egalitarian family structure where the father and the mother kind of have equal roles, right? They are partners. The parents make decisions through dialogue, and both parents help with the children. So, and this is, I think, the really heart of it, that in an egalitarian household, children learn to make up their own minds because they see the parents have a dialogue, and no one parent's always right, and so they have to learn to determine right and wrong for themselves. But in an authoritarian household, all they have to do is obey. So they really don't have to learn. They don't learn this. They tend to learn more that might makes right? That the big guy makes the decisions and whatever he says goes. Okay, so, and I want to emphasize too that this is attitudes and not necessarily behavior, although this does have a lot of implications for how people, you can use this right-wing authoritarian test. People who score high on this tend to have certain things that are true about them. And people will be amazed at this list. They tend to have faulty reasoning, right? They tend to make incorrect inferences from evidence. They tend to hold contradictory ideas, leading them to speak out of both sides of their mouths. They uncritically accept insufficient evidence that supports their beliefs. We've seen this a lot with some of these religious leaders. Uncritically trust people who tell them what they want to hear. Make use of many double standards in their thinking and judgment. So that's faulty reasoning. They tend to be hostile to the outgroups, which is one of the things they're measuring. Right? They're willing to weaken the constitutional guarantees of liberty, such as in the Bill of Rights, because if they're an outgroup or a group that they don't like, they're happy to cut off those rights, and they are willing to severely punish common criminals in a role-playing situation, and they admit they get a personal pleasure from punishing such people. So this is the RWA's highs, as they're called. They tend to be prejudiced against racial, ethnic, nationalistic, and linguistic minorities. They tend to be hostile towards homosexuals. They are willing to volunteer to help the government persecute almost anyone. And they are maybe mean-spirited towards those who have made mistakes and suffered. So that's hostility. There's a couple others here. Profound character attributes. They tend to be dogmatic, zealots, hypocrites, bullies when they have power. They seek dominance over others by being competitive and destructive in situations requiring cooperation. So that's no good. And they are also, finally, blind. They tend to be blind to one's own failings and the failings of authority figures for whom they respect. And this is key for later. So they believe they have no personal failings. They avoid learning about their personal failings, which would presumably help them overcome them over time, right? They might be highly self-righteous, or they might use religion to ease guilt over their acts and maintain their self-righteousness. So this is some of the implications of this sort of family structure, is that if you end up with this right-wing authoritarian personality in your later life, you're going to have these sort of, I would say they're flaws. I would say honestly that most of the things I just mentioned are really character flaws, and they can have a bad effect in the long run. So that's the right-wing authoritarian personality. Now let's take a look at that in religion, right? So I would claim now that this right-wing authoritarianism both has an interesting relationship to religion, which we'll talk about next, and also has an interesting relationship to politics, right? And in a sense, it sort of intersects with the worst of both of those, right? So in religion, we have an authoritarian family structure is actually also very, very good for transmitting religion from the parents to the child. Generally, in an authoritarian family structure, you end up with the father more or less dictating the religion to the children and to the family. Children tend to get used to hierarchies and fiats and all this structure. They tend to be loyal to the family. They tend to be loyal to the religion. There's potentially less, in authoritarian families, there tends to be less education, less exposure to alternative views, because you don't have this dialogue between the parents. It's a well-known thing that if the mother and the father are different religions, that the child tends to not have either one religion. Right? They tend to go off and make their own decision, and that's a very good example of this sort of thing, right? Where if you don't have this reinforcement, the child ends up making up their own mind, and it might be a very different result than what either parent has. So the religion in this authoritarian regime ends up being the legitimate authority that people align themselves with. So these authoritarian people tend to bow to religious authority. They're more willing to persecute outgroups like women and gays and other people of other religions. They're more likely to accept faulty reasoning when it supports their religion, and less likely to accept it when it doesn't support their religion. They are more likely to trust people who are untrustworthy, and we've certainly seen that with the priest scandal and Haggard and all these other folks, right? They tend to be self-righteous and hypocrites, which also plays into the religion thing, right? That you don't necessarily follow the religious creed yourself, but you beat up on somebody who does follow them, or who doesn't follow them themselves. So not surprisingly, many religions tend to reinforce this family structure, right? So it's a loop, right? So the family structure helps the people become religious, but then the religion ends up creating the family structure in the next generation. So here's another slide where you see this in a graphical format. God is over Christ, which is over the man, which is over the woman, and these cones extending down are the sort of spheres of authority. So 1 Corinthians 11:3, but I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of every woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God. So that's more or less that last slide. So let's hear some Pat Robertson quotes along the same lines. I know this is painful for the ladies to hear, but if you get married, you have accepted the headship of a man, your husband. Christ is the head of the household, and the husband is the head of the wife, and that's the way it is, period. So my point here is that authoritarianism and this religious right or this religion stuff ends up reinforcing each other.
The one thing that this does, in addition to promoting the continuing propagation of religion and generating perhaps more bullies, is it generates victims. By training kids to accept authority figures, you're putting them in a position where when somebody comes along and tells them something and they seem to be in a position of authority, or they are in fact in a position of authority, they're more likely to just believe it. And the same is true for sexual predators, where the priest or whoever, and I don't want to blame it all on priests, but they can use their position of authority to attack these children who have been essentially trained to accept some level of authority over them, in that sense.
There is this funny correlation between this RWA, this right-wing authoritarianism personality. It doesn't tend to correlate with people who are democratic, meaning that the Democratic Party ends up having kind of a whole spectrum of these types of people, whether they score high on this or score low on this. The Republican Party, the voters tend to be across the spectrum as well, but as you enter politics and as you get higher up in the politics, the more likely you are to score high on this RWA in the Republican Party. And part of this is because of the way these parties work. These type people tend to crawl to the top. They tend to get promoted within this. So it's interesting that there is this correlation with this RWA personality and Republican leadership. And of course, this makes this whole RWA scale very controversial because people think that, oh, well, this is just beating up on Republicans. This is party politics,